Hello, yes. Um, just give another 3 minutes. You gonna like it? Yeah. Okay, I think we can just start. Um, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you so much for coming to listen to our, another talk, Brownbag series number 32. Um, So again, you are with me today, Madhulana. I think I would like to, because of it's this kind of constant introduction. Right? So, now from Faculty of Social Sciences. Today we have with us Professor Andrew F. Cooper, who will be talking about from engagement to international strategy, Canada's shift to the Indo-Pacific. So Professor Andrew is a well-known specialist on international relations. Prominent among his array of works are several well-known single or co-authored books on Canadian and Comparative foreign policy. Some of the books I can mention, titled like Canadian Foreign Policy, Old Habits and New Direction. This is published in 1997. Yeah, a long time ago. And then the middle powers, looking closely into Australia and Canada in a changing world order. And this is 1993. And then there's another books, Tasks of Global Governance, Canadian Diplomacy, International World Conferences. So basically, this just some of his major contribution to the expertise. So we've talked previously with Professor Cooper that he's at the moment looking further into the perspective of international relations. Of Indonesia, just looking from the entrepreneurial stage, yeah, of G20, which is led by Indonesia last year. I think it's going to be a book as well. So yeah, we're looking forward to it. So without further ado, I think let's give a time for Dr. F. Andrew Cooper to start the presentation. So we will have like a 1 hour of one hour of talk, followed by question.
Maybe I won't take an hour, but I'll take 40 minutes.
That's fine. That's fine. So listen, we prefer to have more interaction by question and answer, so we can discuss, nicely with you. So yeah. So yeah, we can start. The space and time is yours.
Wonderful. It's so good to be here. It's so good to, the Dean, a second time out, colleagues. Yes, in some ways, my re-engagement with Indonesia and indeed with ASEAN came across because of the G20 last year in Bali. We know Bali isn't Indonesia, but certainly in 2022, it was an important site and showed a great deal of Indonesian leadership and, as has been suggested, kind of entrepreneurial ability. Thank you. Canada is a complicated country, but just kind of two snippets that maybe are different from your images from other sort of countries. One, and certainly the embassy made sure that I knew this, was that there's been a long-standing connection, and of course this is extremely important for the Islam International University, that there's been through our development agency, a long-standing, network of Islamic scholars going to Canada, in particular to Montreal, to McGill University. And this isn't something that is appreciated by many Canadians, all Canadians, but I think it is appreciated in Indonesia. And certainly it's not only scholars per se, but also things like, or people like librarians, you know, in terms of their knowledge of holy books and scriptures and so on. So again, that's the one side, maybe the more spiritual, religious component that maybe most people don't know. The other, and of course it's a completely different image of Canada, even though it doesn't have a Canada, is when we drive around, we see, you know, kind of different variety stores. You know, what is it, Circle K's, you know, and usually we stop in for something like a cookie or something, and we say, oh, okay, this is helping the Canadian economy, you know. You know, we're contributing, and again, to show in entrepreneurship, this is a company that was started by three individuals in Quebec, 25 years ago, starting it with one or two little stores, and now you go to Vietnam, you go to Indonesia, and you see Circle K, you know, in terms of, I mean, again, these aren't the only stories about Canada, but they are sort of snapshots into, you know, your view of a country that was probably as different than, you know, than the traditional or the stereotype view of a country. I'm here, and again, support by the Canadian Embassy, to talk about sort of Canada's positioning within the region, not just with Indonesia per se, but with the movement towards Indo-Pacific strategy. And in this regard, we should say from the outset that Canada's never really moved away from the region. Since from the 1970s and the 1980s, there's always been activities. Indeed, we can see in some years that there's been a huge amount of attention, right? Just going back, you know, when I was publishing books, you know, on Canadian foreign policy, 1997, designed at that time by another Canadian Prime Minister as the year of Asia Pacific. So again, we can see that 2022 to 2023 isn't sort of new in terms of engagement. The problem, of course, has been sort of tests and the pattern of engagement. And I would say there's been three sort of problems with Canada's engagement. One, in some ways, is that Canada has too many regional choices. You know, Canada, unlike Indonesia, you know where you position yourself, right? You're a country certainly within the centrality of ASEAN. Canada is very different. You can run Canada through all sorts of different images. Canada as an Arctic country, Canada as a country, you know, embedded in the United States and the Americas, certainly a Canada of Western Europe, with NATO. This is a long-standing commitment from Canada to be a NATO power, a NATO partner, and also a country of however you define it. And maybe this is one of the other problems, is the definition of what this region is for Canada is very different. We can determine through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s all sorts of different definitions, different images, different sort of lenses on the regional construct, right? The Pacific. Canada is a Pacific country. Canada is an Asian Pacific country. Canada as a country of the Pacific Rim, you know, that kind of goes around to Mexico and Chile and around again, you know, and obviously encompasses Australia, New Zealand, and so on. Canada of the North Pacific. And we can see that Canada certainly has some relationships with North Pacific countries that are very different from the rest, right? Just like Indonesia. It's pretty hard to drive around Canada without seeing Japanese cars, Japanese trucks, Japanese SUVs, or indeed Korean counterparts. I mean, this gives a certain sort of connection to those countries that are very different, I think, from ASEAN. But at the same time, we can see that there is sort of a sense of similarity with Indonesia and a connection with Indonesia that goes beyond Japan and South Korea. There was a time back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and maybe this is why we talked about Canada being, and having a year of Asia Pacific, was that the image of Canada and the image of Indonesia were entwined by resources. There was a time when the major mining developments, particularly nickel mining, but other sort of mining, was done by mainly big Canadian companies. Inco, Falconbridge. People of a certain age kind of remember this era. And if people talked about Indonesia, it was usually through that framework. Everybody kind of knew somebody that maybe was an executive or a contractor or somebody that would visit Indonesia in those terms, or parents or uncles or whatever. This is very different from now, right? We can still see that Canada is a mining country, but it's sort of slid down the list of mining countries. And it also has slid down in the number of companies, big companies. And again, we can see that the big Canadian companies usually have been taken over by companies from other countries. So again, this kind of complicates the relationship. Maybe it makes it easier because we're not seen as kind of exploiting or extracting. But again, it cuts down on the leverage that Canada has. And you can see the big companies like Inco and Falconbridge have long sold out to Vale, the big Brazilian company. And again, we can see sort of the compression of the mining industry, right? Big British company, big South African Swiss company, big Australian company, big Brazilian company. And again, so what Canada is left with mostly is the sort of contractors, the mining machinery. There's still a lot of big forums and conventions and fairs about mining in Canada, but we don't really have big companies anymore. So that's another sort of complication. So what we're left with, certainly through the 2000s and into the last few years, we can see that Canada belongs and engages with Asia Pacific and indeed Indo-Pacific. It's done on sort of more of a niche or a marginal perspective. Lots of interesting initiatives. Again, a lot of them are run by the Canadian Embassy, supported, gender empowerment, women in security, supported by some think tanks, and was probably the older one is the Asia Pacific Foundation in Vancouver, 1984. So again, it's not as though Canada has sort of just started thinking about the region in the last few years. There's a long sort of standing connection. And indeed, this has certainly built up all sorts of networks. And when we go around, certainly just in Java, if not elsewhere in Indonesia, you can see these sort of networks in place. And of course, here we benefit also, of course, from future networks of students, graduate students maybe going to Canada, Canadian graduate students coming to Indonesia, again, supported by the embassy and other sort of components of training and so on. But this is all background for the kind of new burst of enthusiasm and hopefully the new burst of commitment in 2022, in November 2022, the release of the new strategy paper in Canada talking about Indo-Pacific strategy. This is very different from the past. This is trying to deal with a relationship in a more comprehensive, sustained fashion. Lots of competition, and in some ways, still some echoes of the past, right? It's not as though we've forgotten Japan. It's not as though we've forgotten South Korea, North Asian countries. Still a lot of connections that must probably go beyond what we find in Indonesia and in ASEAN. I mean, we have connections with Japan and South Korea that are different, right? We belong to the G7 with Japan. We have the tradition very different from Indonesia, right? Support of South Korea in the Korean War. In terms of lots of memorials, lots of memories of an older generation of military personnel and so on. So we can see certainly these images of the Canadian Japanese relationship is going to be different from what we see from Canada, Indonesia. And of course, we can still see the same in Canada, South Korea. There's kind of a longer standing connection. There's, again, these memories of Korean War stamps. We're waiting for a stamp with Indonesia on it. Maybe we should. I visited the Bandung Africa museum yesterday in Bandung. So maybe we could have something that shows some sort of affinity. It's more, there's interesting sort of neatness of this sort of relationship. And as I've said elsewhere, it's probably there's people that connect up with Japan and South Korea that we're still sort of waiting to see connecting in the same way with Indonesia. For instance, our first astronaut, the first, person from Canada to go into space with NASA, after he was an astronaut, moved into Canadian politics, and then eventually asked the co-chair of the Canadian Korean Business Council. So again, we can see that this is a very settled sort of relationship. But once more, I think what is uniquely important about the Indo-Pacific strategy is a new centrality for not just ASEAN, but also for Indonesia. And indeed, it's not surprising that not only does Canada have an embassy in Jakarta, as one would expect, but also we have the mission to ASEAN in Jakarta as well. So again, there's two sort of focal points, I think, in terms of ASEAN-Canadian relationships. And once more, this isn't a completely new relationship. The question is to reinvigorate it, recraft it. It goes back to at least 1977. Canada was probably being ahead of most other countries as being a dialogue partner with ASEAN. There's also, of course, a sense of, if not tension, between Indonesia and Canada, certainly a different of views of the two countries. As I've said, and you know it far more than me, there is a centrality of ASEAN and Indonesian thinking, Indonesian practice. Canada sort of moves beyond, doesn't want to be trapped within a kind of one area. It kind of sees Canada as being a country that can kind of link up different regions. And again, we see this on trade policy, that Canada, certainly under the leadership of our present Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, been very active in building the so-called CPTPP, the Comprehensive, Progressive, Trans-Pacific Partnership. Again, Indonesia, more cautious, more reluctant, more sort of willing or active in the confines or in the embeddedness of ASEAN. We can also see that the same sort of, if not tension, but the issues of syncing Canada and Indonesia comes out on free trade. We talked, and indeed I've talked to people and the experts at the Canadian Embassy about movement towards a Canada-Indonesian free trade deal, and it seems to be moving, but it's moving, somewhat slowly, somewhat, over time. It's certainly not an overnight success story, but it is moving. So once more, we can see that the quest for Canada is to really try to embrace ASEAN in a more central way, in the same way, if not absolutely similar to Indonesia, to buy into that centrality of ASEAN. And again, we can see all sorts of evidence of Canada kind of privileging the ASEAN relationship. And we can see, again, trying to build business relationship, diplomatic relationship. For a long time, Canada diplomatic missions were a bit thin in ASEAN countries, and now we've caught up again. We have missions in every ASEAN country, even countries that we had left go for a while, Cambodia, Laos, and so on. And even beyond Indo-Pacific, even kind of into the Pacific, we now opening a new embassy in Fiji. So again, we can see sort of all sorts of different momentum for these type of approaches. But it's still uneven. We're not kind of accepted as a country that gets kind of not only membership but access to every meeting within the ASEAN orbit. And again, the two examples are the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN defense ministers, plus that Canada has participated, has been invited to, but not every year. So again, it's not kind of a full-fledged member. It's kind of done on a somewhat random or somewhat ad hoc or some sequential sort of meeting. So again, this is something to look forward to in the past. So there are risks as well as rewards. We're there. We've got a strategy. Certainly there's a huge amount of commitment. But just to sort of finish up in sort of the test of this new relationship. And indeed, I can kind of see there's probably at least three sort of major tests, and maybe the second is the biggest, but just the first is that level of commitment, right? The sense of Canada not eroding, not disappearing, not sort of saying that it's committed to Indo-Pacific and then backsliding and moving away from Indo-Pacific. The second test, and as I've said, maybe this is the most serious test, but it also shows some sort of similarity between Indonesia and Canada. Neither country, I think, has a foreign policy that embraces connections with big countries at the expense of connections with other big countries, big powers, right? Canada and Indonesia both kind of wanting to avoid making explicit choice between particularly China and the United States. So obviously in Canada's position, we're close to the United States. We belong, as I've said before, to NATO. We have a free trade agreement with the United States. But even there isn't a desire to lock Canada into only a relationship with the United States. And of course, the same with China. And again, here, and I think this is also the parallels between the two countries, a great emphasis on rules, on order, on some degree of stability within the international system. And again, we can see that certainly our Deputy Prime Minister, now Finance Minister, but formerly Foreign Minister, certainly worried about not just Chinese disruption. Again, this is language that comes out in the Indo-Pacific strategy, disruption of China. Also, of course, we've seen the Trump administration, right? Disruption can come from the United States as well. So again, there's worries and just worries on the Canadian side, but also presumably on the Indonesian side. And again, here we can see lots of different points of tension between Canada and China, but not tension that moves away from a relationship. We don't see sort of an abandonment of China. Many Canadian companies and sectors are very keen on further developments of markets in China. Certainly, there's a lot of pull still of China in the post-COVID arena. But with this, maybe at some point, there'll be a time when we do have to make choices, more so as probably Canada than Indonesia. We see a lot of pressure to sort of be pulled into new security arrangements. Here, I think we can say that so far, Canada hasn't sort of joined up in terms of new security informal institutions, but we can see Canada kind of operating in ways that maybe sort of at some point are seen as a sort of counterbalancing China. We certainly see activities of Canadian planes, Aurora planes on anti-submarine surveillance. We certainly see a number of Canadian frigates moving into the Indo-Pacific and operating in the Taiwan Straits. Again, Canada doesn't see this as particularly provocative, but if you were in Beijing or Shanghai, maybe you would have a different view. But on that basis, we can see that even though there's some think tanks in Canada that are pushing for Canada to take a more assertive style vis-a-vis Canada or U.S., China, you can see that Canada hasn't joined at least the two major new informal institutions. And again, if you haven't been following other sort of activities of Canada or, Indo-Pacific, certainly these are two initiatives that I'm sure you have seen or paid attention to over the last few years. One, of course, is the so-called Quad, the quadrilateral security dialogue. And of course, we can see why it's the Quad with 4 countries. Countries that maybe we wouldn't have been expecting 5-10 years ago. Japan, of course, Prime Minister Abe in the past, very active in building that relationship. The United States, both Democrat and Republican, keen on building this relationship. Australia, despite sort of trying to balance China as well. And interestingly enough, India, of course. India belonging to some institutions that have China as a member as well, in BRICS, in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but certainly we see India moving into the Quad as well. Fascinating. But Canada has been reluctant, has refrained. And the second, maybe gets more attention than it deserves, is the forum that brings together kind of the old kind of Anglo countries, right, to work not on nuclear weapons, but on nuclear powered submarines. And again, huge amount of attention on this, whether this is just a harbinger for things in the future. And we can see that certainly it must be important because not too many technical institutions and functional issues bring together leaders of countries. It's hard to get Joe Biden to Indonesia. It's hard to get him to come to most countries, right? He's a busy person. So to sit down with the Australian and sit down with the British Prime Minister and deal with this shows that this sort of relationship is important. The third, and here again, we can see the parallels between Canada and Indonesia. There was a time, of course, we wouldn't put Indonesia in the list of robust democracies. Certainly Canada at one time, of course, had many issues with Indonesia and with some other ASEAN countries in terms of authoritarian governments. Myanmar, we still have the tensions. But certainly Indonesia now, of course, as we'll see in the next, 6 months, hugely robust democracy, Canada democracy. And of course, here we can see more similarities than differences. And of course, here the as we talked before over lunch, certainly this is one of the more unanticipated components of Canadian foreign policy that Canada kind of brings together. Indian Ocean, India, Pacific security or initiative or strategy. And of course, we find that one of the more controversial issues has been the challenge or the accusation that Indian intelligence officers assassinated a Sikh activist outside of Vancouver. Again, we can see all sorts of fallout from this, right? Fallout that other countries, certainly our Five Eyes partners, including the United States, had to kind of choose whether they supported Canada or decided to stay quiet. And certainly we can see the fallout of pushing a wide number of Canadian diplomats out of India, right, including our consul general in Mumbai, a whole variety of diplomats, at the expense, of course, I should add, of the Sikh community in Canada, because of course many want to go back to India, to the Punjab, and now find that at least if they've taken out Canadian citizenship, it's very hard or impossible to get visas to go back to India. So again, highly complicated approach. And again, we can see that certainly this is a major test. But if there's tests and if there's kind of risks involved, I think for the most part, this is a very optimistic story. It's an optimistic story, certainly that maybe starts at the leadership level, but it filters down, right? Anybody like me who comes to Indonesia sees a country very different than the country, of Indonesia 20, 30 years ago, right? Dynamic, young population, a country of entrepreneurs, a country of ASEAN centrality, but increased willingness to sort of move out and have a role and a profile in the global arena. So on that basis, I think there's lots to talk about. There's a lot to digest in this forum with graduate students and professors. But at the same time, I think the main thing is just to embellish the main theme that Indo-Pacific strategy is here for the medium and long term. And indeed, even if I don't come back and talk about it, other people will be coming and talking about it. And whether you like it or not, Canada will become part of the narrative and the script of Indo-Pacific, even if we compete and jockey for position with all sorts of other countries, right, that also have an Indo-Pacific strategy. And again, we can see that almost every major country in the world now has that. But Canada's in the mix, and it'll be a real treat for me and an honor to hear the comments and the questions that you have to further the conversation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Professor Andrew F. Cooper. You know, um, we've been failed by Professor Cooper to go through this kind of geography from land to the sea, you know, just talking about Canada's international relation engagement. You know, from previous decades, you know, where Canada has been showing a consistency in manifesting more values for the free trade, you know, a kind of positive, peaceful international relation. Just like, you know, for instance, he has delivered the fact that, you know, Canada has been reluctant to engage with the security-centric type of, you know, cooperation, but choose more involved in entrepreneurship type of, you know, international relation with Indonesia, Korea, Japan, and now looking forward to more to many different interests, although there are tensions and challenges, and you know, positive for a peaceful relation with Indonesia, especially through its relation within ASEAN. So yeah, with that, so I think just, you know, the floor for you to ask. I believe we've known that many students here, you know, doing PESTL's search, you know, that in some countries in the Pacific, including, you know, Indonesia, and then the son who are doing about South Korea, and some students from student doing, you know, classes on Pakistan as well, in Africa, just like, you know, somebody over there. I just mentioned your name. So, without just take some questions you can ask, you know. Okay, we have Famara and Zan and also Fahmi. Okay, just no, two questions first. Okay. You know, trigger us, so yeah, okay. Yeah. Time is yours. Okay.
Individually or three?
Yeah. How is it going with you? I mean, one by one. All right. We'll take one by one.
Just my memory at this point might disappear from the complex question. We'll take them. I mean, this is a very good question because I think in previous sort of bursts of enthusiasm for the region, most probably there's been a suspicion that it's being kind of business driven. Even the days, again, a colleague and I most probably wrote the first article on APEC, in 1990. So we, at that time, studying, these sort of new regional initiatives quite closely. And even though it was a state-led initiative, behind the initiative were lots of government business relations. And Canada certainly was in the mix, lots of kind of networks of business groups, companies. Some of those companies have disappeared. I mean, Canada's had a lot of successful companies, but some have kind of withered over time, not just the mining companies. And you could see the same in Japan, that there was a lot of kind of suspicion that a lot of the APEC initiative was sort of Japanese companies and Japanese business groups sort of pushing. Those days are over. I mean, I don't think anybody sees Indo-Pacific as a strategy that has Canadian business only as the dominant force. I mean, obviously, there's Canadian business wants to take advantage of a prosperous, dynamic Indonesia or a dynamic, prosperous Malaysia, and in some ways, the most successful companies now in Indonesia are companies that are in Indonesia for the long term, but they're also very kind of stable, conservative companies. They're companies, and for instance, in the insurance business, Sun Life, Mutual Life. Again, if you look through Jakarta, you will see this. I mean, it doesn't have Canada on the forefront, but they're definitely Canadian companies with headquarters in Canada. But these are not kind of extractive, exploitative. They're trying to make people's lives in their retirement and their elderly decades much more secure. But that's only one thrust of the Indo-Pacific. I mean, and I think that's your component of the question, is that there's a lot of other now transnational networks that there's a real rationale to have Indonesia and ASEAN at the central. I mean, one of the major thrusts of the Indo-Pacific is gender equality, gender security, and this makes a lot of sense. There's an awful lot of focus. I mean, not to say that Indonesia needs Canada help and Canada doesn't need sort of other help from other countries, but there's huge transnational networks now along those lines, right? Of academics, think tanks, activists on environment, right? On shared future and green technology. I mean, one of the similarities still is we're still both big nickel producing countries. So how can we translate that into kind of lithium batteries that will provide support for increased, e-cars and e-trucks and SUVs and so on. So again, we have a huge amount of commonality in that regard. But finally, of course, there's no question. There's also this kind of defense security component as well. It was probably different from the past. In the 1990s, I mean, this was very post-Cold War. We weren't really worrying about an emerging country, a rival country, right? We were kind of looking at niches in those days, and certainly my work on middle powers was very much focused on this. It wasn't focused on big geopolitical rivalries. It was focused on landmines, on child soldiers, on issues. And again, from a Gambian perspective, Gambia, of course, has been very active in the International Criminal Court. You've had justices who've been very, very supportive in some ways of International Criminal Court, even though Gambia also has been very critical of International Criminal Court for maybe focusing too much on Africa, right? Not focusing enough on other parts of the world. So Gambia is a fascinating small country, but a fascinating with lots of intellectual capabilities and connections with the UN and so on. So again, there's going to be those differences. Now, most countries, it would be negligent if we didn't kind of look at China and say, oh, if there's, you don't have to be John Mersheimer, to kind of look, and say, well, it's a good idea to at least think about what are the worst case scenarios. If China does invade Taiwan, if China does sort of become increasingly aggressive on the China Sea. I mean, this isn't a Canadian problem, but it's a problem for Vietnam. It's a problem for the Philippines. It's a problem for a lot of different countries. It might even become a problem for Indonesia in a much more explicit fashion. But I would say again, just to underscore what I've said in the presentation, Canada and Indonesia are kind of together in one thing. At least up to now, they don't want to make clear choices. They don't want to say we're only in the U.S. camp. And of course, certainly, we don't want to say we're only in the Chinese camp. So again, it's going to be fascinating to see how this evolves into the future. Very different approaches by Canada and Indonesia, but there's certainly some fundamental similarities.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. So it's kind of ringing a bell to look further into the commonality between Canada and Indonesia. We've kind of heard many similar things. Let's say, for instance, I think this kind of peace culture that also embedded in Canadian societies, politics, international relations, something like that. So yeah, I mean, next question we have from Nizam. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor. My name is Nizam. I'm from Social Science. So, yeah, nice to see you again. So basically, that something really interesting to me talking about the Canada influence in the Pacific, especially because currently I'm studying about Indian Ocean, international relation in Indian Ocean. So I'm really curious to what extent the influence of Canada in Indian Ocean, because what I read from several articles that state Canada has its own Pacific strategy, which is the new initiatives and resources, and it includes how to promote peace, investment, expand trade, supply chain resilience, building sustainability, and it also try to become active and engage to be partner in Indo-Pacific. But my first question is, to what extent do you think this kind of strategy enhance the investment or the engagement of Canada in the Pacific? And the second is because what I feel after I learned a little bit about Indian Ocean, especially the rise of China, the emergence of China is literally vibrant nowadays. And how do you think with this strategy Canada can balance or counterbalance the China's, especially with the Belt Road Initiative? Thank you very much.
Very good question, and it shows in some ways Canada is in a very fortunate position, right? I mean, certainly Canada has not had to worry about its core defense interests for a long time. We belong to NATO. We also belong to NORAD, in terms of the Northern Command. And if you remember, most probably the major incident between China and the United States was the balloon incident, right? And even though you can say that President Biden was the one that kind of, okay, we're going to shoot the balloon down, most of the activity was kind of NORAD activity, right? Where Canada is a partner. It might be a junior partner, but it certainly is a partner in NORAD. And in some ways, if you were suspicious about the balloon, it was because the balloon was over the headquarters of NORAD in Colorado. So it's not surprising that somehow Canada is in a more kind of advantageous position. When you're in that, if you worry about threats from big rival powers, from the Soviet Union in the 50s and 60s, from China now, you also know for the most part there is going to be some sort of layer of protection if you're really a pessimist, a realist about these sort of issues. India, of course, is not in that position. I mean, I'm more interested in India in terms of the institutional connections of India. But I know from talking to Indian think tank people prior to COVID and looking at their writing since, of course, is that Indian geopolitics has changed considerably. Is that the whole image of string of pearls is very much embedded now in Indian thinking, and that almost every country, every island in the Indian Ocean is a source of competition, not between the United States and China, like in maybe the South Pacific, but in terms of between India and China, right? For influence, whether it's big islands, Sri Lanka, whether it's small islands, Seychelles or others, this is going to be the dominant trend. And certainly from that perspective, we can see sort of a hardening of Indian perspectives, that in some ways the kind of relative relaxed view of India that economics would trump security seems to have been reversed. That now India, for the most part, sees the Chinese relationships through a security image rather than through an economic. And indeed, sometimes having desire not to have Chinese technology coming into India and so on. So again, India is kind of the country at the core, very, very much in the pivotal position of Indian Ocean. Canada isn't a player in that regard, So in some ways, even though Canada almost is a player in every region, we can't really see that Canada is a major player in Indian Ocean politics. I think we're going to leave this, to other countries, and hopefully they'll sort of play out in other ways. The problems for Canada are more if there would be some sort of supply chain obstruction. It'd be more of an economic problem driving up inflation, preventing some supplies coming in, bottlenecks, and again, people that have studied geoeconomics for years have always worried about these sort of scenarios. But even on those scenarios, other countries would be far harder hit by some sort of crisis in the Indian Ocean, including countries like Japan, right? Or, we're also lucky, of course. Again, maybe the environmentalists would have problems with this, but I mean, we're relatively energy secure in Canada. We're not worried about bottlenecks of energy coming from the Gulf or other places, so we're even from European countries worried about Russian transportation. Canadians, I think, for the most part, are somewhat savvy about geography, but I would think most Canadians really have very little knowledge about what you're, knowledgeable about. They don't really think about the Indian Ocean. They don't think about Djibouti, having all sorts of different military personnel and naval outposts. Canada doesn't have a naval outpost in Djibouti. Sometimes we fly personnel into Djibouti, but we're not a major player. So in that sense, we're a country that again can kind of sit back and focus more on the Indo-Pacific rather than the Indo. And again, it gives us some sort of leeway, but again, it shows perhaps the limitations of Canadian policy. Even getting to Indo-Pacific strategy, I think, has been a real move by Canada. So we don't want to kind of overstretch or over commit where really both the resources and the risks become extended.
Okay, thank you for the answer, Prof. We can go to the next question by Moin.
Thank you so much, Professor. My name is Muhammad Moin Pasha. I'm from India. Currently, I'm a master's student in Faculty of Social Sciences. I have three questions. One is, what is the impact of relation between India and Canada on the Pacific, as well as on global trade economy? And the final is relation impact of livestock Indian diaspora in Canada.
Yeah, second question. Slowly.
The impact of developing relationship between India and Canada on the Pacific. And what is this impact on global trade economy and on the livestock Indian diaspora in Canada? Thank you.
Fascinating question. I mean, Canadian-Indian relations, I mean, it's kind of to use kind of a novel, it's kind of I don't know if you've read Dickens, it's kind of the best of times and the worst of times. Sometimes we have a very, very good relationship with India, very close connection at the leadership level, close relationship at the societal level, huge amounts of activity in terms of connection, and of course of immigration to Canada, a very sizable Indo-Canadian population, also a very active political community, very different from, say, the Chinese Canadian population that for the most part doesn't play a major role in politics, plays, very low-key, kind of under the radar. Indo-Canadians are not like that. They're very active. They're very sort of assertive about politics, very savvy about politics. But the worst of times is really downturns in Canada-Indian relationships. And we've seen at least 2 or 3 of those big downturns. I mean, one originally was on nuclear questions. Our development agency, CIGI, provided a lot of support for what they thought was going to be the promotion of nuclear energy in India with the Indira Gandhi government. And then, unbeknownst to Canada, all of a sudden, India tested a nuclear weapon, which of course caught Canada by surprise. There were sanctions on India. Not that India really noticed terribly much, but it certainly was noticed in Canada that this was seen as maybe it's extreme, but kind of a betrayal of Canada. That in some ways Canada was trying to support India in economic development, and India went in a very different direction. So certainly that was the one. And we saw also lots of different problems, in the post-Cold War, on some of these initiatives that Canada saw as being very normatively attractive, even on anti-personnel landmines. Canada saw this as a very, standout initiative. India was very reluctant, right? Sees landmines as being a legitimate source of defense against its neighbors, laying down anti-personnel landmines on the border of India. And then in the background, other sources of tension, even though they're not major sources, they're kind of simmering, Kashmir and other sort of areas. So certainly, and then of course, finally, with the case I've put out in this presentation, that Canada once again sort of sees itself as being, if not betrayed, certainly as India using techniques that Canada wouldn't have expected a democratic country to use. This isn't to say that it depends on your view of democracy, what countries do this type of activity overseas. But certainly, I think there was an expectation that India, because of the robust democracy, that it wouldn't participate in that type of, targeted assassination of dissidents outside of India. So again, we're in a very delicate position. I think both countries probably will come out of this as we've come out of bad relationships in the past. There will be an election in India. Maybe after the election in India, there'll be more of an allowance to kind of cultivate Canada again. And of course, we'll have an election in Canada within maybe 2 years. So again, we might see a change but right now, as Canadians, we have, we use sort of sporting analogies, like Indians use sporting analogies. We'd say that we're in each other's penalty box at the moment, that we see India as being in the penalty box. Probably they see Canada as being in the penalty box, and it's just a question of how long we're in the penalty box, and how long we sort of come back into a different situation. I think most Canadians hope. I don't think there's a deep set animosity against India. I think there's a lot of huge amount of admiration from India about how they've managed economic development, how much they've managed all sorts of kind of intellectual and technological issues over the last decade or so. And certainly a lot of Canadians go to India as tourists, non-Indians who go to India as tourists, right? It's still a very attractive place for Canadians for whatever reason, right? They want to go there. They want to see India. They want to see the kind of diversity of India. So again, I think there's probably over time there's going to be I think from an Indonesian perspective, though, and again, this is sort of a theme that I keep reinforcing to the embassy, that we have to accept that we are in each other's penalty box for a while. So from that perspective, Indonesia becomes even more important, right? That if India isn't really a central pillar of Indo-Pacific, in some ways that increases the need to focus on Indonesia. I mean, Indonesia is definitely not in Canada's penalty box or vice versa. So again, I think if anything, you have to kind of, if you're a good diplomat or a good sort of activist or whatever, you have to kind of see or take what's given to you. And right now, what's given to you is sort of a clearer path of centrality for ASEAN and for Indonesia. So from my perspective, I hope that the Canadian embassy and indeed the Canadian government will do this. You have to sort of take what's convenient and not just what you hope for, and we would have hoped for better relationships with India.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Prof. Yeah. So that is kind of optimistic type of answer. Putting a lot of hope. For the improvement of the relation between Canada and India. So yeah. So yeah, we can go after maybe somebody else was raising their Fahmi, but I think we should give you time for the another expert to clash with another expert. So yeah, after Balsillie, we can go to Shafi'i for a while. Yeah, we still have a lot of time, like 30 minutes straight, so it's okay. Okay, the time's yours. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Cooper. This is not a question, but just thinking. Frankly, I haven't read this Canadian document on the Pacific, but I did read the other countries' documents on the Pacific. US has one, Japan has one, EU has one, Germany, France, you name it. My problem with all these documents is that when they're talking about in the Pacific, they look at it through the lens of US-China rivalry, right? So ASEAN, in particular, probably Indonesia, is seen or deemed important as long as US-China rivalry is there. So ASEAN is not really seen in its own right, that this is a robust region that is thriving, economically growing, and so on. But suddenly ASEAN and Indonesia become important because there is this rivalry, right? And even for example, the US presidents keep
skipping ASEAN summit and so on and so forth. So there is this giddiness in capitals in Southeast Asia towards these major powers view about Indo-Pacific and ASEAN. That's my thought. Secondly, there was a time in the 80s when Canada and Australia were very active in promoting the idea of middle powers, right? All this conceptual framework of middle powers came originally from Canada and Australia, and that was very strategic. That Canada and Australia find the ways to form their own policies as middle power, introducing, for example, human security, right? That's now is a regular lexicon in IR and strategic studies. Now, in the context of Indo-Pacific, there are minilaterals, right? AUKUS that you mentioned, Quad, and so on, but they are not middle powers. They are middle powers with superpower, right? Kowtowing the Australians, Japan with the Americans, and so on. But I'm glad to hear your presentation that Canada has yet to move into that kind of direction. But I think these minilaterals are bad for Indo-Pacific because it's slicing the regional framework of Indo-Pacific. What's your thought on that? Because that's minilaterals. I think it's bad ideas, in my view.
Indo is on the radar for 85 or 90% of Canadians. It's very much through the prism of U.S.-China relations, no question. But from a governmental perspective, I would say that you shouldn't exaggerate that completely. I mean, because in some ways, diplomatic, what would you say, activities kind of show that there is something that's legitimate or authentic about the focus on ASEAN and Indonesia. I mean, all you have to do is see the pattern of ministers and indeed even our prime minister visiting Indonesia, right? This isn't a pathway that you would say kind of fits in with a realist perspective. We're not trying to counterbalance Indonesia or China or the United States by having a relationship with Indonesia. This isn't kind of a realist perspective. But when you have our prime minister visit Indonesia, I know there's Bali G20, but 3 times in a year, where you have our Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Trade even visiting Indonesia 3 times in a year. This is different. This looks again that we're kind of buying into ASEAN and Indonesian centrality. And on that basis, and again, I've said this in other presentations, whether it's this presentation or presenting about kind of entrepreneurial states, I think Canadians have the same view of Indonesia in the same way as the BBC. When you're in transit to Indonesia and you're in Vancouver, or if you're in Taipei, you look up on the screen and there's the BBC usually in the airport, and they have adverts from the Indonesian government. And it's different from Turkey or some of the other countries. That it's purely, Turkey, it's kind of almost like a Turkey I've never seen before. It looks like Western Europe on the Mediterranean. It's tourism, it's playing golf and tennis. In the south of Turkey, Indonesia, the message is very different. It's not about the Canadians should come or other people should come to Indonesia as tourists, even though a lot do come as tourists. It's about Indonesia as a dynamic country. And we first started seeing this again, because I was spending so much time looking at the G20 in 2008, 9, and Indonesia then had adverts about Indonesia, dynamic, young digitally sophisticated country, and it was a very different message than other countries. It wasn't, again, come to Indonesia as a tourist. It was just a promotion of a kind of an image or a culture of Indonesia, which I find, you come here and you talk to students. Yes, the culture and the image is very accurate. It might not be right through Indonesia, but certainly at the university level, how can you say that this isn't the case? It is. It's a young, dynamic, digitally sophisticated country. So in that sense, why wouldn't Canada want to have a connection with a country like this? Yes, there's going to be constraints, Jakarta, traffic and air pollution and so on. But still, this is a very different image than a country, again, like Turkey. That country, Canada is not going to sort of see Turkey as a digitally sophisticated, young, whether that's unfair or fair. It just doesn't sort of hit Canada in the same way. Indonesia, there's an image and reality that seem to fit, and that from that perspective. The second question, again, this is really probably what I'm thinking about most these days, is how do you fit into this new type of institution? We've accepted, or at least some of us have accepted over the past, that the only route is formal institutions, right? These universal oriented. But I think that pathway is over now. You look at the UN and say, well, does anybody really expect the UN, as a UN Security Council to kind of be able to solve problems? I don't think so. Maybe the functional UN will be very good. The specialized agencies. They have good records in many cases. IMF, World Bank. I don't think too many people are going to say that there's going to be some sort of magic elixir from the World Bank or the IMF. And in some ways, Canada has benefited from those formal institutions. Again, I've said elsewhere, Canada was a beneficiary of those sort of early arrangements, right? We have a constituency within the IMF. We're almost kind of like a sub imperial power in IMF. We have our small Caribbean countries that are part of the Canadian-led constituency within the IMF. This is very different. So how does a country that has embedded into that formality, how does it adjust to these new informal? Not very well. We don't really know what to do in some ways. We don't want to fit into the image of what you've suggested. We don't want to be kind of tied in with the United States and small little clusters of countries. It doesn't do us any good. We have those problems. If we're going to be clustered with the United States, we'd rather be in NATO with a lot of other countries, or having to deal with the United States head on. NAFTA negotiations, even dealing with US and NAFTA. I think most Canadians would prefer not to have Mexico. We prefer just to deal with the United States straight on, have to not get complicated by border issues of Mexico or images of Mexico or, cheaper production, migrant issues, and so on. So we're in a very complicated position. What's clear, though, because of that complicated position, there's no rush to join, these new, whether you call them minilateral or new informal institutions. There's no kind of appetite to really belong to that. The only one we do belong, and I've mentioned this before, is kind of an institution that has kind of come out of the shadows in some ways. And of course, this is the Five Eyes, that in some ways it goes back at least to the same period of the UN and NATO, where for most Canadians, we knew that we belonged to the Five Eyes, but nobody really knew anybody that works for them. And if we did, they wouldn't tell us anyway. So, and they're kind of beyond the kind of normal processes of institutions, right? But now the Five Eyes has summits, they have public diplomacy, they have, communiques from meetings. I wouldn't say it's totally transparent, but it's visible. And like it or not, Canada's stuck. We're not going to abandon the Five Eyes. I mean, it does give us some sort of privileged access to information, but it also can embarrass us, on some occasions, because we're tied in. Exactly what you're saying. But at least with five, it's different than some of these other institutions that we're still seeing, where we see Australia with the United States and the UK, or Australia with Japan and India and the US. Again, I don't think Canada has much appetite. If it really came to the crunch where there was some sort of conflict with China, yes, I mean, Canada would, there's no question that Canada would be a Western, Northern, US centric country, no question. But I think most Canadians hope that it doesn't come to that question or that condition.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Wow. Yeah, we can just go to Pa Shafi'i.
Thank you. Well, this is most probable a simple question, which is a continuation from our discussion during the last session. Based on my reading and observation, Canada is one of the best countries in dealing with the issue of pluralism and multiculturalism compared to any other Western countries. This is important in a way that we see the relationship between Islam and the West. To a certain level, there is a tension, although there is a process of reconciliation, etc. Frankly speaking, I would like to know what factor causing this, effectiveness of Canada in dealing with the issue of pluralism and multiculturalism. Why? Because this is crucial in relation with the relationship between Islam and the West, particularly because during 2 decades, the rising or the growing influence of the Islamophobia in certain Western country, in UK, in France, etc., Netherlands, yeah, which is not so good for, say, promoting more understanding, mutual understanding and respect, between Islam and the West. What factor causing this one? Could you share this kind of experience of Canada's experience in dealing the issue of pluralism, multiculturalism, and then, of course, promoting peaceful relationship? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think Pa Shafi'i's question more towards like a domestic dimension, but I think it's going to relate as well to the behavior of Canada, like the international norms, in dealing with the other countries.
In some ways, it goes back to Canada as a country of immigration. That I'm always struck by when you go to Germany or other countries in Western Europe. They talk about migrants. I think too many people talk about migrants in Canada. I mean, we do have some migrant issues. I mean, but it's still relatively marginal. Again, Canada, like it or not, is I don't want to language, but I mean, some people would say a fortunate country, right? We don't have a border with, with countries that have fallen into crisis, that have become, corrupt or chasms. So it's easier for Canada. I mean, Canada can be a fairly regulated country that, I think most Canadians would say, as long as there's the same rules of how to become an immigrant, doesn't matter whether you're Sikh or Muslim or, Buddhist or anybody else. I mean, it's not a huge question. There's obviously going to be a question, and I'm surprised in some ways haven't got that question already, on Gaza and Palestine. And of course we do, this kind of tests the level of pluralism and tolerance, because of course we have a relatively large Jewish pro-Israeli population in Canada, certainly in big cities, Toronto. We also, of course, have an increasing Muslim right through I think it's fair to say, without being a sociologist, right through the political economic stratosphere. I mean, we have wealthy, middle, poor, very poor. So on Gaza and Palestine, we do see those possible tensions coming out, and that would be a a big difficulty for Canada because it kind of doesn't fit with the model of Canada. But two things I'll say, I'm not a government representative, but I will say two things about what I see, as a citizen that have been very reassuring. One, of course, is that even though we haven't had the presence in Gaza that, say, Indonesia's had. I mean, with the hospital, an Indonesian hospital, the Turkish hospital, and so on. We've had all sorts of Canadian medical personnel in Gaza. I mean, Muslims, non-Muslims. I mean, there's been a huge amount of activity for the last 10, 15, 20 years in Gaza. This is not new. I mean, sometimes when the Gaza situation implodes, there's kind of an awareness of how much kind of regularity of movement back and forth there is to Gaza and how much time medical personnel have spent going to Gaza and operating out of, even in good times, these are pretty horrendous conditions. I mean, never mind now. So that's the positive. And the second is that, because Canada allows dual citizenship, that there are a lot of dual Canadian Palestine in Gaza. I mean, there's a lot more in the West Bank. I mean, just like there are a lot of Israelis that have Canadian passports and Israeli passports as well. So on that basis, as I've said before, it's not just because Fajar is here. I have to give a lot of credit to the Canadian embassy officials, the consular officials, particularly in Cairo, in Egypt, about the way they've handled the kind of exodus, if you can call it that, of Palestinians, people from Gaza, that have been I think, very humanely, once they're out of Gaza, meeting them when they exit, taking them to Cairo, looking after them emotionally, physically, medically, facilitating transportation, in some cases to Cyprus or other, but of course, many cases to Canada as well. These are two very positive things that I think are the kind of tolerance of demonstrations. I mean, again, as we said over lunch, there's no water cannons or kind of police repression, certainly against the pro-Israeli, but the pro-Palestinian. I mean, it's expected that under these sort of conditions that there's going to be protests. Sometimes you kind of wonder why, the U.S. Consul General is the magnet. I mean, there's a lot of other places, but it makes sense in some ways. They close off the streets. People disappear before dark. There isn't huge riots. I mean, it's for the most part very, very peaceful. I mean, sometimes the dialogue can get, ratcheted up, and one side or the other, they're looking at social media and saying, "Oh, so and so who's a lecturer in this university said this or that. They should be fired." For the most part, that's not the case. It's more kind of stigmatization rather than any sort of personal. But it could, I mean, I would like to be optimistic, but at some point, maybe there will be, a kind of it becomes so intense that it becomes more physical and more, intolerant. But right now, I think I'm pretty sanguine that again, whatever the position on even a very, very, very sensitive issue like that can be kind of conditioned by Canadian tolerance, openness, pluralism.
Thank you.
And so on.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. So we can have like another. We can have another 10 minutes to take two more questions. Yeah. So we have like Fahmi has been waiting patiently, tolerating. Baca Shafi'i. Okay, after Fahmi, we go to Musabah. There is one last question. Yeah, so yeah. Thank you, Fahmi, for keeping it short. Yes. Yes, sir.
Very active, active in 2003. I was kind of more connected, both in think tanks, but also politically at that time. I was amazed by the astuteness of the Canadian government in 2003, not to join. I mean, it takes a lot of, as we would say in Canada, guts to kind of say no to the United States, right? To say, no, we're not in this. Particularly, and this is where I'm a little skeptical of the business community driving foreign policy, because the business community in 2003, it was this sort of image. Oh, if we don't join the United States, they'll retaliate. They'll close the border. They'll take our car companies away. They'll make them all in the United States. It was, and nothing really happened. I mean, most people don't make economic calculations or decisions because we move into an invasion of Iraq or not, I think it was a very sensible approach, but still there were, it wasn't the end of the story. And again, because I worked quite closely with the prime minister who came in after Mr. Chrétien, who made that decision, there were sort of pressures from the United States in other ways, right? So Canada ends up by having a much greater profile projection in Afghanistan because of that original decision not to go into Iraq. And there was kind of this calculation that Canada couldn't say no twice. That it could say no to Iraq, it could get away with that, it could kind of stare down the business community, but it couldn't say, particularly with the NATO, with even the UN, component of the Afghan, it's easy to forget that this was seen as a very legitimate process in Afghanistan, as opposed to the illegitimate in Iraq. So, Canada paid some cost for this. I mean, didn't pay a cost like other countries, but we lost about probably 150 personnel in Afghanistan, which for a small country or a middle-sized country is something, and with a huge amount of trauma. I mean, not the trauma that the Afghans have had, but a certain amount of trauma that many people still kind of feel, and not just in military personnel, but NGOs and all sorts of people that spent years, decades in Afghanistan. So these things are never straightforward. There's never just sort of a quick decision and that's it. It always kind of plays out for a long time. And of course, we've seen this. I mean, we were talking about Afghanistan and refugees and so on. I mean, we still have this kind of in-between group of Afghanistan personnel that worked with the Canadian forces, that supported Canada in its mission in Kandahar, particularly. I mean, one of my students, I'd never seen him, I've never met him, but I had these Zoom meetings, from him in Kandahar, and then all of a sudden he disappeared. And I'm thinking, oh God, Ahmed, how's he doing? And then all of a sudden he's holed up in Kabul, and then he gets out to Qatar, and he's living in British Columbia on the West Coast, helped by military personnel, retired military personnel who kind of saw him as a loyal person and somebody that deserved support, So again, all these things are hugely complicated, but behind everything are human stories, right? I mean, there's always human stories, however you make the decisions in the first place.
Okay. We can go to the last question. Who's that?
My questions maybe little bit small and deep at the same time. We know that Canada has a position when it comes to international issues, and it is always said that foreign policy is source.
Yeah. I mean, I think the positive on Canada is that the record overall, certainly on a bilateral relationship, has been, a commendable one. I mean, I don't think there's been too many cases where Canada sort of chose to support an autocratic government. I mean, Myanmar is a good example, right? I mean, huge amount of Canadian effort on Myanmar during the last 10, 15 years, both at the Canadian diplomatic level, in the NGO level, but also kind of special rapporteurs, special ambassadors. Our present UN ambassador, Bob Ray, had also had a major part in being kind of a special ambassador to Myanmar. So I think that gives you some sort of credibility in the region, right? I mean, not that everybody, within ASEAN is kind of playing a tough game with the Myanmar military government, but at the same time, I think most people are all on the same side. I mean, they'd rather have a government that was very supportive, of ASEAN principles, the Charter, and so on. I think most Canadians, and to some extent non-Canadians, see the Palestine-Gaza-Israeli situation as totally unique, in terms of a policy. I mean, I don't think there's many cases where Canada is going to suffer because of their support on UN resolutions. I mean, there's no sort of pressure to kind of either kick the Israeli ambassador out in Canada, or on the other part to kind of sanction the representative of Palestine, particularly in Montreal. Very sophisticated spokesperson for Palestine. And I think I would give some sort of shout out to Canadian kind of public state television that begins, I mean, it's probably at the beginning was not sort of equal in their presentation of the crisis. But I think as the crisis has evolved, very equal. I think there's been a lot of pressure to have, if you have the, usually it's not the Israeli ambassador, but it's the spokesperson for the Israeli Defense Force. But then after, usually it's he that's on, then they will have somebody in Montreal, usually, who's the representative of the Palestine Authority. Just because I don't think you can operate, without that sort of, basic balance. So again, I don't see sort of this really translating into a stigma of Canada in terms of the region. I don't see Canada kind of being brought into the mix, as a country that has given sort of total support to one side and no support in the other. And I mean, from a societal perspective, it would be very silly for Canada to do that because of, as we've talked about before, there's an increasing Muslim population. There's a population that will come out in the streets if there's some crisis. So to kind of try to stigmatize that sort of population or to kind of marginalize that really doesn't make much sense. I mean, all it is a recipe for disaster. And for one, what I've seen from the Europeans, it's a very different approach, right? I mean, you kind of go to Western Europe, and even though you can kind of like so many parts of Western Europe, you just think that this is not the way to have a long-term policy. But it makes it easier in Canada, as I keep coming back to, when you have a real immigration policy where you select immigrants, or you have a kind of a fairly managed form, even in refugees, right? That Canadian officials go to the camps, or did go to the camps when they could, in Lebanon, in Syria even, and bring whole intact families to Canada. It makes a lot easier for integration, for economic development, rather than bringing, kind of individuals, and again, We
Okay.
have some luxury in Canada.
Okay.
But there's one thing, and I don't think there's any Australians here now.
No, not yet.
But I think, again, to give in terms of Canadian policy, there's one thing that Canada wouldn't have. I mean, Indonesia is an archipelago, but I mean, there's no way that Canada would have archipelagos of migrants kind of holed up in some sort of island off Canada waiting for 10 years or 15 years.
Mm,
Whatever the problems in Canada, it's not that problem. I mean, we just don't treat migrants in that way.
Yeah,
So
fascinating.
even though we have a lot of commonalities with Australia, as has been middle powers and so on, we don't tend to have that hard side that, the kind of that kind of hard shell of a country that Australia has had in the past. Indeed, in some ways, has it now, right? Canada, I mean, there is problems in Canada. There's inequality. There's problems. Sure, there's difficulties of migrants or immigrants adjusting.
Yeah.
But it's not this sort of sense that somehow there should be mass incarceration or mass detainment of potential migrants. I mean, I think there's still, for the most part, an optimistic view that if you've gone a long way, you've been on a boat, you've been in internship camps in whatever country, then it's probably you're going to make a pretty good immigrant, right?
Yeah.
You're going to have ambition. You're going to see some sort of value. You're not just going to sit there and say, well, we'll take subsidies from the government. You're going to,
Right.
and this is the case of Vietnamese boat people in the 80s.
Yeah.
I mean, you name it.
Right.
This is the case.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Andreas Cooper. Let's give him a applause. So yeah, by listening to him today with this kind of articulation, then I think the end of the program is that we're looking forward to see, these relations between Canada and Indonesia. If I might say, you take it as the ideal country to be within the Pacific for Canada, then we are so much looking forward to in the next several years, hopefully. So let's keep in touch. Well, thank you so much. So we can have a slightly account photos, right? Yeah, tradition.
Okay.
People, thank you so much for coming. Thank you, thank you. You know, next week we're gonna have a celebrity from South Korea. We will have a celebrity from South Korea on Wednesday. Okay. The one that has probably a link with K-pop, BTS, and Pink. Tell your friend, to attend, okay?